I believe that my next question is to be directed to you, Professor Mackenzie. I've long been curious about the veritable explosion of new versions of Protestantism that occurred shortly after Luther's actions. If Luther was so important in the early years of the Reformation, why did these other forms develop? Was Luther a primary influence on the men who led these changes?
Well, Paul, the short answer is that Luther was not the only reformer. You probably remember that even before Luther posted the 95 Theses, there were men like Erasmus who were calling for one reform or another. And then certainly after Luther began his great work, there were just a lot of other men who participated with Luther in the cause of reform. Now, many of them were inspired by Luther. People like Melanchthon, or Johannes Bugenhagen, or Johannes Brentz, and many others. But there were still others who didn't follow Luther precisely in every respect. These reformers, well, these other reformers generally, each worked in his own context, and so the course of reform varied from place to place and from person to person. Now, of these, some were Lutherans, followed Luther pretty exactly, and so would become the founders of our own Lutheran Church. But there are other schools of Reformation, so to speak. We have the Reformed, we have the Radicals. In England, we have the Anglicans. And as our course progresses, we want to talk about each of these in turn. But let's begin with the Reformed. Now, by Reformed, we mean the 16th century churches that broke away from Rome, just like the Lutherans, but whose descendants today are churches like the Presbyterians, or the Reformed Church in America, or the Christian Reformed, or even the United Church of Christ. Now, from one respect, they're like the Lutherans in that they did break away from the papacy in the 16th century. But they did not follow Luther in some very important respects. Especially in the area of the sacraments, they developed a different kind of Protestant theology. And so they ended up creating a distinct Protestant tradition, one that, similar to the Lutherans in some respects, but very different in other respects. Now, in the Reformation era, there are a number of theologians from the Reformed family. There are people like Huldrych Zwingli or Heinrich Bullinger. Probably the one who's most familiar is John Calvin. But the man that we probably need to start with is the great reformer of Zurich, that is Huldrych or Ulrich Zwingli.